And we're back. It's Mike and Nijay talking about the Apostle Paul, as we like to do. Hello, Nijay.
Hey, Mike, good to see you. I've heard that you're in kind of super lockdown again, so I won't tell you about all my travels over the summer, but at least you guys have gotten some vaccination recently.
We've got a lot of vaccination. Got me some Pfizer. Love me some
Nice.
Pfizer. First one gave me a dead arm. Second one kind of knocked me down for a bit. I
Okay.
kind of went down and feeling a little bit weary for about 24 hours. But we're up and running, and in the safety and security and the insularity and the confines of my house. I'm still trying to crack on with all the good things I'm doing. Not quite the sabbatical I was planning for. I'll be honest with
Yeah.
you. I had plans of international travel, going to San Antonio, hanging out with good peeps like you, Nijay.
Right.
But alas, we'll have to wait for Denver, Colorado in 2022.
Well, yeah. First of all, let me say, just don't make plans. Pretty much ever, but maybe this is the the more the respite sabbatical versus the active sabbatical.
No, it's not the respite sabbatical. I can tell you that now. I mean, I'm having to homeschool some very
Oh,
non-cooperative children
I've been
um,
there.
who who like to control alt to YouTube whenever mum and dad are not looking. Yeah, we've all been there. We've all been there. But oh boy. But yeah, I'm looking forward to maybe meeting up in Denver. I love
Yeah.
it. The city that smells like an Rastafarian art teacher's car. Um, that's what I think about when I think of when I think of Denver. That and some omelets and an incredibly big blue bear. That's what I think about.
Well, it smells less pot than Portland, so I have a whole different experience of it.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. Fair enough. I do like the Broncos, but that's the Brisbane Broncos, not the Denver Broncos. But I always think of my Brisbane team when I go to Denver. But
Fair
anyway,
enough.
Nijay, today we're in Romans 9 to 11. We've been in good Scott McKnight tradition. We've been working through Romans backwards, which, as we all know now, is the standard way of reading Romans.
That's right.
That's been introduced by Scott. But now we're going to work through Romans 9 to 11. Now, I think for many people, would this be right, Nijay? Romans 9 was written for Calvinists and Romans 11 was written for dispensationalists, and no one really knows what chapter 10 is about. But is that your reading? It's chapter 9, being the good Methodist you are,
That's
chapter
right.
9 is kind of your Waterloo. This is where you realize being a Methodist is just an act of folly. It's possibly even an offense against divine sovereignty. And chapter 11 is we find out about the Jews and the end of the world.
Well, yeah, my experience is that a lot of the people that I've talked to, they just ignore it. It doesn't have a lot that's helpful for today in their minds. I don't know if you know who the scholar is, but I think there was a 20th century scholar who said, um, uh, Romans 9 through 11 was tacked on as a sermon, as a kind of additional sermon to the letter, and
Yeah,
doesn't really fit into
I
the
think that
letter.
was C.H. Dodd. It was
I
that was
think
C
Dodd as well.
it
Yeah.
was Dodd who said, and actually in Dodd's defense, if you go from like Romans 8:39, if you jump to 12:1, it does kind of make sense. I mean,
Right.
you could think, oh yeah, therefore in view of God's mercy,
Yeah.
it does make sense. But and then you get people who are the opposite, who think like 9 to 11 is the kind of the climax of Romans. I mean,
Yeah.
everything else was just an extended introduction, and this is the real issue that Paul gets to deal with. um, I think it's fair to say that there are some important connections between Romans 8 and then what comes. And tell me what you think of this. This is because I mean, when I did my commentary, this is kind of what I learned, that Paul is talking about that's the one,
Right
about the
here.
Paul is talking about the great assurance that we can have. Nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, neither angels nor demons nor anything. And you can imagine, if someone's hearing this saying, yeah, Paul, that's all good and all, but I kind of have noticed that most of your Jewish brothers and sisters have not really grasped or jumped on this Messiah bandwagon.
Right.
And it would seem that the enduring, never giving up love of God kind of gave up on them. So, how do you deal with that? So, I mean, if you've got this great idea of assurance, I mean, how does that relate to the Jewish people? Does that mean God's faithfulness ain't that faithful? So I think that's one issue within the logic of the letter. But I think Paul also has to deal with the fact that, many of the Romans are living in places, possibly in proximity to Jews and Jewish communities. And the issue of unbelieving Jews is not like a theoretical thing, okay? It's something that's in their face on a daily basis. And many of them probably had some degree of interaction with Jews previously, if they were, former God-fearers or something like that, or many of the Jewish Christian leaders of the Church of Jewish Christians. So I think both the logic of the letter and the social situation that the largely Gentile Christians are faced with means Paul has got to deal with the issue of what's up with the Jews not believing in their own Messiah. Now, are you similar to that, Nijay, or do you have a different opinion?
Yeah. I mean, when I was in high school, college, I was given the message that Romans is this um, almost theological text. And I didn't learn a lot about the situation, background, kind of who's in the room when this thing is delivered. And, we could talk about theodicy, we could talk about, big theological questions. But scholars like Richard Longenecker have done a good job of saying, okay, what is actually going on in the churches? Paul Meniere's, Scott's done this more recently, that there seems to be kind of a tug of war going on in Rome, in the Roman churches. This is a very important city for Paul's ministry. And even in the key places in the letter, you see the Jew-Gentile question come up. Chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Not ashamed of the gospel, power of God for the Jew and the Gentile. I mean, you have that there. You have it in chapter 3, the question of God does not play favorites. You have this throughout. And so I kind of do see 9 through 11 as sort of the thing that's been on everybody's mind.
The elephant in the room. The elephant in the room.
Yeah, exactly. And actually,
I told you before, the kosher elephant in the room.
Yeah. I mentioned to you that I was waiting for my daughter's bus to come, and I just picked up Frank Matera's commentary on Romans in the Paideia series, which is actually really, really good. And he has a great introductory couple pages to set up 9 through 11. I'll read this to you. I'm curious what you think. So he says, the fourth part of Romans deals with an issue that has been simmering throughout the letter, the destiny of Israel in light of the saving righteousness that God has so recently manifested in the death and resurrection of Jesus. He goes on, but he says this, what I think is interesting. He says, Romans 9 through 11 plays a central role in Paul's gospel of God's righteousness, for if the apostle cannot explain the continuity between God's saving righteousness manifested to Israel in the past and God's saving righteousness manifested in Jesus Christ, there is no continuity between what God has done and what he's presently doing. And then Frank's really good at just kind of summing up things. He says this, in a word, there's a festering wound between synagogue and church. I think that's a little bit of an overstatement, but what do you think about what he says there?
Yeah, I think the issue of continuity is important, because I think there were some Gentiles in Rome who were kind of more Pauline than Paul. Okay. Right. So I think there was some saying maybe on the basis, like maybe they've heard what Paul said in Galatians, or that type of, where he's really, pushing sort of against the law and against the sort of the proselytizers. And they're kind of taking succor from that and going further. So the gospel is not for the Jew first and then the Gentile, but it's for the Gentile instead of the Jew. And and people are using Paul as a license plate, saying, whoa. Okay, look, I believe in faith over Torah. That's fine, but not like that. And I think he's saying that is, if you guys are using me as the kind of advocate for that position, no way, that's not the way. And I think he is trying to be more ecumenical between Jewish and Gentile Christ believers, but also talking about how they relate to Israel. And I think it comes down to the nature of his righteousness. If God's righteousness is right, if God's faithfulness is faithful, then it's got to be good news for Israel too. Not instead of Israel, not despite Israel, but it's got to be good news for Israel too. So how do you explain Israel's unbelief? Well, let me lay it out for you. But I think Matera is right. The question is of continuity. in the sense of how is the good news good for the Jews. But if I can segue to another good Catholic scholar, Thomas Tobin,
Yeah.
who was probably more known for his stuff on Philo. I think he passed away a couple of years ago now.
Yeah, that's right.
But when I read his Romans commentary, he divided up Israel into three, not Israel, he divided up Romans 9 to 11 into three parts. He said it talks about Israel in the past, which is basically chapter 9, Israel in the present, which is chapter 10, and Israel in the future, which is chapter 11. Now we can haggle over the details and where that is precise, but I actually think that's a good taxonomy, because I think it breaks down, like chapter 9, he's talking about, well, look, there's always been a kind of rupture within Israel. There's always been a kind of Israel within Israel. There's always been, an elect within the elect. And he kind of goes through, and he divides up into Israel according to the promise and Israel according to the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, and he says, and Israel according to the promise now includes, this is where he gets down to like the Hosea quote, it includes Jews and Gentiles, and now a part of that Israel according to the promise. And it's not that God's purposes or God's righteousness is bad, but unfortunately they stumbled over the stumbling stone, that type of thing. So that explains the reason why there's a rupture within Israel. Then he kind of talks about how Christ has come, and so there could be righteousness for everyone. And and I think some crucial words in Romans, they occur twice, is uk diastole. There is no difference. So just as there's no difference in condemnation, in chapter 10, there's uk diastole. There's no difference between Jew and Gentile confessing Jesus as Lord, which is why he thinks there needs to be a continuing mission to the Jews. That's what I think about preaching. I think it's all about, we've got to keep preaching to our brothers and sisters in Israel. And then chapter 11, I think he deals with the remnant issue. He starts off on that, and then he wants to show the interlocking destiny of Jews and Gentiles. The Gentiles only get in on the heritage of the Jews, and the Gentile Christians will hopefully drive the Jews to jealousy, so the olive tree will fully be unified. And then he kind of has a more eschatological vision of the future, where the Jews get saved in whole or in part through themselves. So that's I found Thomas Tobin very helpful for sort of breaking things down that way.
That's funny, because before you said that, I just turned to another part of Mattera's commentary where he actually says the exact same thing, past, present, future.
Oh, cool.
Lays it out. So maybe they had a conversation about that. But I want to make a comment and then ask a question. So the comment is, I'm doing a lot of work right now on Greco-Roman religion and how the early Christians would have fit into that, came out of that, interacted with that. And when we talk about the character of God, when we talk about consistency, one thing that's really interesting to think about is how fickle gods were in the ancient world. They were always willing to change allegiances for the best deal or the best followers or something like that. So just as an example, there was a practice in the ancient world called invocatio, that when, let's say, my nation conquered your nation, before I go in and kind of destroy your town, I would call out to your deity, and I'd say, hey, oh God of Melbourne, we have a great home for you back where, in Portland. If you come now, come peacefully, we'll take all of your stuff, and we'll set you up nicely. Otherwise, we're gonna sack this town. And so this idea that a god might leave, abandon the people, and switch to another people to look for a better people, a better home, was something people thought about. Another example is the city of Tyre, when they were about to get destroyed. They chained down their statue of Apollos, afraid that the statue would actually fly away, escaping the city and escaping the destruction. And so it is a legitimate question to ask, can God be trusted that he will stay good on his promises, and that he hasn't just changed his mind and gone in a different direction and changed a plan? So we have to get ourselves into that environment, that world, to actually start to process why some of these questions might come up. But I want to ask you about the Edict of Claudius, because this has been a long time discussion that has been connected to some of the tension between Jews and Gentiles. So I'll tell you what I've heard in the past. I've passed this on to my students, but it's been questioned in more recent years. So the idea is there was a great Jewish kind of origin to the church in Rome. Longenecker talks about this in his works. And so there's a kind of a Jewish foundation and flavor. And then you have Gentiles coming to faith, but you still have Jews kind of leading the church, Jewish Christians leading the church. And then you have the Edict of Claudius, where Jews are expelled from Rome. And so this would mean a lot of these Jewish leaders are gone. And then you have this power vacuum, and then you have Gentiles taking that up. And then you have Jews return. And then you have this kind of tension within the church where Jews are saying, hey, this is our show. We've been here for a long time. But then you have Gentiles saying, maybe it was an omen, a bad omen that you were kicked out, and maybe we should be in charge. And this relates, I think, to the question of favoritism. Does God doesn't play favorites? There's no parity with God. But I know your friend Mark Nanos, who I don't know personally, but I've read his work. He questions that narrative. He questions the edict, and he questions using the Edict of Claudius as a linchpin for this approach. Tell me your thought. I can't remember what you do in your commentary, but tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, here's my view. I think the Claudic Edict was indeed relevant. I mean, if all of the Jewish Christians had to get up and leave, and we know from Acts this happened as well, because, this is how Paul comes across Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth. So they kind of have to pack up their bongos and leave. But then they go back some, 6-7 years later. I mean, that has got to have a social impact. Okay. I mean, and the fact that they left, I think they probably remained in correspondence, but, when a significant number of your church leaves and then comes back, I mean, that's got to have an impact. Some people have raised a little bit of doubt about the relevance or the impact based on the fact Paul never mentions it. Paul doesn't say, look, I know it's really bad what happened when all our Jewish brothers and sisters got kicked out, but now that they're back, the deaconate needs to retire, and we need to reinstall Priscilla and Aquila and all these other friends back into the office of leader of the house churches. I mean, he never says anything explicit like that. And people like Ross Wagner, John Barclay, with Mark Nanos, have raised questions about, how important was this sort of the edict of Claudius, the expulsion and return of Jews. So I think they're right. It should not be overplayed, but it does make a lot of sense, particularly when you get to the later chapters. Which is 12 through to 15, where you do think that there are some simmering differences about, like, the law, how much of the law should Christians obey, and do you treat with respect or do you treat with contempt people who have a different conviction to you? And this is where I think maybe the weak and the strong comes in. So I think there is something to it, but I don't think we should necessarily make it the big programmatic thing that explains, everything. But another thing is, say, like, you could write if there's a church that's having some problems with unity, and let's say it was about the Trump election, or about mask mandates, where churches are divided over that. You could write a letter to the church talking about unity without mentioning Trump or masks or anything like that. You could do that. You could just say, look, let's just focus on the things, some people, believe more in their personal liberty, and let's find a way to work together. I mean, you could address the issue without mentioning Trump or masks. And I think maybe in the same way, Paul is dealing with the aftermath of this event. He's dealing with the aftermath, so he doesn't necessarily have to say what the original chronology. He doesn't have to provide a chronology of what originally went happen, because everyone just knows that. Okay. So that's kind of how I see it.
I want to ask you, not Romans 9 through 11, I want to ask you about the S word. The S word is supersessionism. So this is, if predestination was the conversation in the, 20th century, or, I guess many centuries before that as well, I feel like the conversation around Romans 9 through 11 now is about supersessionism. Replacement theology is sometimes language that's used. So for those of you who are not initiated into this language, Supersession is the idea that it's almost a colonialistic kind of mentality of Christians coming along and stealing Jewish history, literature, theology, religion. And so applied to Romans 9 through 11, it's the idea that Paul is kind of bait and switching by applying scriptural language to Gentiles that and Christians that he ought not to. And so people use this language really freely. It's hard to define the word supersessionistic. People talk about supersessionistic readings. How do you process all that? Because it comes up a lot in reference to Paul's letters. Sometimes Paul is called anti-Semitic. Sometimes he's called anti-Jewish. Sometimes he's called supersessionistic. Um, is Romans 9 through 11, does it fit that description to you?
It comes down to what you mean by supersession. And does Paul think that the Jews have been voted off the island, or they've been given a rose like on the Bachelor, and they're told to leave, and now it's just with the Gentiles? Is that what Paul believes? That does Paul believe in a replacement of ethnic Jews by Christian Gentiles? And the answer is categorically no.
That's right.
And I think it boggles the mind when anyone would think that, unless you're a kind of, liberal German Protestant in 1930s Germany. I mean, it really just boggles the mind why anyone would believe that. But Paul does believe that Israel's Messiah has come and brought together Jews and Gentiles, and they are the locus of God's saving purposes. So I don't think the church replaces Israel, but to use a phrase I got from Marcus Bockmuehl, the church are the representatives of Israel in the Messianic age. Okay, and
interesting.
So I mean, I like that way of language, which is also very sort of Qumranite language. But here's the other thing: in the sense of one group succeeding another, or believing that they are the kind of the Israel within Israel, that's actually quite a common disposition within Judaism. The Qumranites, or the Qumran Covenanters, they tended to see themselves as as the congregation of Israel, or the Yahad of the last days. I mean, they saw them as a special elect class. If you read 1 Enoch, particularly some of the animal language, the animal metaphors imply that there's a kind of a righteous elect group within Israel. Even the rabbis saw themselves not just as the successors to the Pharisees, but something of their improvement and replacement. Okay, right. So within Judaism, the idea of there being a kind of an Israel within Israel was a very common disposition. Okay, but when it comes to the topic of supersessionism, the idea that what does Paul think? Does he think the Jews have been replaced? Or the alternative, oh no, the Jews are fine. They don't need Jesus. Jesus is only for Gentiles. So Jesus is proclaiming. So Paul is proclaiming Jesus as the Jewish savior of Gentiles. The Jews are fine under what's called a Sonderweg, the special way, or their own special dispensation. So that's the kind of two extreme views. The Jews have been voted off the island, supersessionism, and the Jews have their own special way. Here's the thing I've come across in recent months, Nijay, is Paul explicitly attacks both views.
Right.
Okay. If you go, let me take you to 2 verses in chapter 11, which hopefully our listeners will like. Now, in terms of a real hard supersessionism, Paul puts that to bed. In 11:19, he kind of parodies the view. He says, "You will say the branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in." And that's where he attacks the view. I mean, if you think that, look, the Jews, like an olive tree, the Jews have been snapped off, put aside, and you've been put in to replace them, he says no. They were broken off because of unbelief. But if they come back to believing, then they can be put back in. And then he says, oh, by the way, if God is willing to break off the natural branches, you can bet sure he's willing to break off the unnatural branches. And if he's willing to put the unnatural branches on the tree, you bet he wants to put the natural branches back on the tree too. So he definitely attacks the view that there's a replacement of Israel or Jews by Gentile Christians. But then when you get to verse 23, he rules out a Sonderweg. Okay, he rules out a Sonderweg view. Because he says, and if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in. Okay. So in other words, he's saying the Jews, the people of Israel historically, still need their Messiah. They still need Jesus. So, I mean, this is something I've been working with in recent months. I wrote an article in Harvard Theological Review, um, largely defending N.T. Wright against Mark Reasoner and Joel Kaminsky. But also I've been working with our good friend Scott McKnight on a book on Paul and Supersessionism. We took the title from an essay by Bruce Longnecker called God's Israel and the Israel of God, where I try to argue that Paul does have not a replacement theology, but he does have a view that God's purposes, plan for salvation for the world, for Jews and Gentiles, are located in Christ. And that does kind of supersede, in a sense, certain things that came before. Not because Israel's religion, traditions, and heritage is a bad thing that's been done away with, but because it's a good thing that's been fulfilled. Sorry, I probably ranted on a little bit too long with that, but
No,
that's where I get to on the supersession question.
No, it's really important because we do have to be careful of Marcionite kind of thinking and anti-Semitic thinking and the ways we approach Paul. I don't know if you read the book by Joshua Garraway, Paul's Gentile Jews. I remember poking around in it, but it's this idea that Gentiles have this hybrid identity in Christ, where they are Gentiles, obviously, ethnically in terms of not being Jews, but then also Paul attributes some elements of traditional Jewish identity to Gentiles. So, for example, in Philippians 3, I was just working on this with my students. He says, we are the circumcision, and some translations say we are the true circumcision. Some people are upset about that. I understand not saying that or not saying spiritual circumcision, but the fact that he says you are the circumcision and you're not circumcised has some meaning for Paul. And so I kind of like that idea of Paul's Gentile Jews, that they are somehow, Richard Hayes talks about this in his Galatians commentary, but they're somehow kind of included within this people of God identity. I think it was actually Tom Wright who popularized using the language people of God for the continuity of the people of God, the Old New Testament, rather than saying Israel and church. I've kind of caught on to Tom Wright's use of that. But I want to quote something to you from an essay in this book, reading Paul's letter to the Romans, a little collection of essays edited by Jerry Sumney. There's an interesting chapter by Elizabeth Johnson on Romans 9 through 11, and she addresses the whole issue of the Sonderweg approach about what if there are two ways, what if there's Jews follow Torah and Gentiles don't. And she says this is really interesting. Some contemporary theologians have suggested in the sobering decades since the Holocaust that Christians ought to consider God's covenant Israel to be untouched by the death and resurrection of Jesus, that God's promises to Abraham and Moses abide for Jews, and that Christians may trust God's independent promises to the church. That's what you'd said. Paul would find such a solution highly unacceptable because it excludes Christians from their God-given identity as Israel, and it deprives Israel of its own Messiah. And I've used that a few times with my students because students are attracted to a two ways approach because it seems more compassionate, or it seems more kind of live and let live kind of a mentality.
Yeah.
But this idea of depriving Israel of its Messiah is a really interesting aspect that we don't often bring into the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean that I deal with two passages when the Sonderweg view comes up. I go to Galatians where Paul says, "If righteousness could come through the law, then Christ died for nothing." Yeah. Okay, if because, and I think what Paul says in Romans is that Israel too is in Adam. They've been infected by the Adam virus, so it's not just the Gentiles with their ignorance and immorality, idolatry, and impurity. Israel too is in Adam, and they need the new Adam, who is also the representative of Israel, the Messiah. So if righteousness could come through the law, Christ died for nothing. And there's also a great quote from Tom Wright I like, and he says, "To say that there is no place for Jews in the family of the Messiah, that is anti-Jewishness." Okay, that is anti-Jewishness. And the fact that Paul himself is writing as a Jewish Christian, with other Jewish Christians as part of his co-workers, goes to show that at least Paul thinks Jews such as himself need to die with Christ and to receive his resurrection power in the present and in the future.
All right, we've talked about the S word, supersessionism. The other big controversy of this text, and there are a lot, but this is the big one, is all Israel will be saved.
Oh
That
yeah.
is, I mean, many articles, books, dissertations have been written on this. I haven't done a ton of work on Romans 9 through 11, but I did work on kind of a parallel text in Galatians 6, where it talks about peace be upon you and mercy upon the Israel of God. I think it's some similar issues there. It's the question of Paul's attitude towards Israel and how he's using the language, and whether he would ever use the word Israel as a way of talking about the Messiah's people, Jew and Gentile, or perhaps what we might call the church. I mean, it's interesting. I don't think there's any way to predict which way a commentary is going to go. I think you and I, some of our favorite Romans and Galatians commentaries, they're pretty evenly divided on who takes the view that it's ethnic Israel, this kind of holding out hope for like a last minute mass conversion kind of situation, versus those who view it more as a spiritual Israel, or all encompassing Israel viewed as the people of God under the Messiah. I actually can't remember what you say in your commentary, but how did you? I'm sure when you wrote this, you had to put some extra thought into it.
Yeah, I did.
So
I did have to go into this one a little bit of depth.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, I mean, people I know, like Tom Wright, and I think Joe Fitzmyer think that the all Israel will be saved means the sort of the bringing together of Jews and Gentiles in Christ in the final day, which is fine. And I'd be more inclined to see that in Galatians 6. Okay, so in Galatians 6 is probably where I would be more inclined, but not. I mean, here's the interesting thing, Nijay. For Paul, he always uses the term Israel as a positive word.
yeah,
Okay, Israel is always a positive term for Paul. He can talk about the Jews, the Yahudios, we call that Jew or Judean. He can complain about the Jews, the Judeans, but Israel is always a positive term. And I would argue, maybe with the exception of Romans, one little verse in Romans 9, but generally when he means Israel, he's talking about ethnic or empirical Israel,
yeah, of
kind of
course.
like the supergroup. And I think that's what his concern is at the end, that eventually all Israel, ethnic empirical Israel, will have some sort of reconciliation with God in Christ in the future. So I don't think he's referring at this point to a Israel as a kind of union of Jews and Gentiles. I think Galatians 6:16 is a better place where you might find that view working. Probably the best thing that people can read on this, I think Susan Eastman has done a couple of essays on this
She
topic.
has.
I don't find her convincing on the Galatians part, but I do find her convincing, or at least very stimulating on the Romans 11:26 part. So that's a kind of a couple of essays I would recommend if people want to chase this up. Yeah, I know. I've had a few discussions with Tom Wright on this verse. This is one of the few places where we have a parting of the ways,
Right.
if you like, is on that. So I'm more inclined to see it as ethnic or empirical Israel. What about you? Have you attained any clarity? Well, first of all, tell us what you came to on Galatians. What because Galatians 6:16 is kind of like the hors d'oeuvres, and then you
Right.
and then you kind of give us the main course.
Okay, so normally I tend to side with Dunn in Galatians, but I disagree with him. I think if I remember his commentary, I disagree with him on this, because Dunn's basically saying Paul's been very tough and kind of push back on kind of works of the law and things like that. But then at the end, this is kind of a olive branch
Yep.
kind of thing. And I feel like to me, that's just inconsistent with the forcefulness of his argument throughout. So I think I favor the view there in Galatians that it is more of a, people of God under the Messiah, Jew and Gentile together.
Yeah, that's why
Um,
I agree.
Romans, see this. I want to play devil's advocate with you a little bit on this because I've switched back and forth. If I remember, John Barclay favors the ethnic Israel view. If I remember that, I think he always takes the opposite of Tom Wright's view. So that was just this the starting place. But I if I recall, and I think I was persuaded by that. But a couple things really bother me about that. One is just this idea that it will sort of all happen at once at the end, is a little bit hard to imagine, almost seems artificial, that happening after how many, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But not that that's impossible. But the second part is, Romans 9, I think, especially plays into God not focusing on blood or ethnicity, but focusing on his plans, which are often hard to predict. How can we know God's ways and things like that? So then he talks about choosing, uh, you know, splitting lines with Jacob and Esau and things like that. So this idea then at the end that he's going to come back to that seems tricky in light of the ways that he's talked about it. I feel like it would give back too much of what Paul's trying to say at the beginning of the letter, which is he's not gonna just do things because you happen to be a part of this group. Um, I don't know. So I feel like that was the favoritism question is, oh, as long as I'm a Jew or as long as I'm a Gentile, then I'm in God's good graces. And it would seem at the end there, if he says all others will be saved, it would be saying, well, then as long as you're part of this, you're in his good graces. So I think a modification of that view is the remnant view, that the remnant will be saved. Is that closer to what you're thinking, or do you think
Yeah,
it's
I
kind of
mean, you've got the issue of the identity of Israel, and then the meaning of the word all. Does all mean like all without exception, like a kind of universalism? Or does it mean like all who put their faith in Jesus? Because remember, you got to like 11:23 says, if they do not persist in unbelief. So
right?
you've got the, what does the word Israel mean, but also what does the word all mean? So I think you're sort of wrestling with both there.
What about the call? Remind me, I don't know, remember exactly how it says, but the call of God is irrevocable.
Yep.
How do you take that statement?
Well, that's the idea that God's electing purpose for the. I mean, He's not going to unelect the Jews. Okay, He's not going to say, He's not going to invalidate the election because of Venezuelan angels who messed with the divine voting machines or anything like that. So I couldn't resist that analogy. Just talking to an American, I've got to throw these funny things. Italian satellites with their laser. Okay, so I'm sorry. There's nothing like that. Okay, so he's not going to unelect the Jews, but as he says in chapter 9, elections got a little bit more complicated. There's an elect within the elect, or in chapter 11, there's a remnant. Okay. Or in chapter 10, there is a kind of stumbling. So he does talk about a rupture and a division within Israel caused by, we could call it, the messianic question. But he believes the resolution to that is going to happen at some endpoint. And the result of that is God's mercy will triumph over Jewish disobedience. I think that's the good news. He says, no matter how much disbelief Israel has, no matter how much hostility, he even says they're enemies on account of the gospel. I mean, Paul actually uses some. He uses some,
It's
not
harsh.
just in like you think of like Philippians 3 or other passages here. He actually uses some real negative language to talk about unbelieving Israel, but he
Right.
seems to believe at the end, though, God's mercy triumphs over their disobedience. And that's what he seems to be driving at, which is why he says to largely Gentile congregations, don't think that they've been voted off the island. Don't treat them with contempt, because their disobedience is for your blessing, and your blessings will bring them to bring them back. So he wants to argue, I think, for like an interlocking destiny of Jews and Gentiles that in a mysterious way, and he does use the words mystery, in a mysterious
That's
way
true.
gets resolved at the final time. Okay. So if I can use a Marvel analogy, did not think Endgame was going to end the way that it did.
Yeah.
Okay. Where everyone comes back at the end.
Yeah.
Okay. Remember how everyone comes back at the end? Everyone comes back at the end, and the good guys win. God's mercy triumphs over human rebellion. And I think that's where he ends. And that's why in Romans 12, he can say, therefore, in view of God's mercy, mercy sums up what he's just been discussing.
But the problem is the second Gomorrah the same as the first Gomorrah?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
That's what you get when you
No,
use a
sorry.
Marvel analogy.
I was thinking of the city Gomorrah.
Oh no, Gomorrah
So
from
you lost me.
Endgame.
No, from the Avengers. Yeah. No. Yeah. Well, I'm
I
sure.
think I think the challenge. I mean, that so much of trying to interpret Romans 11 is just following his argument. He can use words that he normally uses in more literal ways in figurative ways, like circumcision. And he
Yeah.
does that in Romans. He does in Galatians. He does in Philippians. So he's very capable of doing that. I think that's the argument for the I don't want to use the word spiritual, but the non-ethnic Israel.
Hmm.
But I think it raises the question: um, is the Messiah Israel's Messiah, ethnic Israel's Messiah, or is it the Gentiles' Messiah, or is it a non-ethnic Israel's Messiah? That's an important question to answer from Romans, I think, to get at that. So I go back and forth. I think right now I'm in the Tom Wright kind of camp for this, but I could be persuaded otherwise.
Yeah. Well, so the other big issue in Romans 9 to 11 is the use of the Old Testament, because a lot of
Yes.
these issues, and it's funny because Romans 5 to 8, there's kind of a dearth of explicit mentions, maybe the odd
Right.
allusion. But then when you get to chapters 9 to 11, it is just dense. I mean, he is just, pile
One
driving
after the next.
one after, but then he also combines stuff as well. He'll like conflate biblical passages together in a way that's super confusing. So he's doing this. So he's doing this kind of argument, drawing on, on Israel, belief, unbelief, making these, figurative or literary allusions, and doing it all with this avalanche of citations, allusions, and echoes to the Old Testament, largely in the Greek version, which means it's truly a dizzying argument to follow. I mean, because it is dense, particularly you get through Romans 9. Yeah. So, any thoughts on the intertextuality of Romans
Yeah,
9 to
actually, I was
11?
going to ask you, but I'll mention a couple things. One is I counted, I think there's 44 different references to the Old Testament. I was going to ask you about Paul's hermeneutic here of reading the Old Testament, because I noticed the same thing, that it's very intentional. He does this in Galatians as well, especially in chapters 3 and 4, where there's this kind of stuffing of that. Now, I'm guessing in Galatians, Paul is having to kind of parry, like fencing. He's having a parry encounter.
On multiple fronts,
The
multiple
opponent's
fronts.
use of some of the same text, like Abraham and things like that. It can't be exactly the same way in Romans, because Paul's not been there in the same way, and he doesn't explicitly talk about opponents. But the way I talk about what Paul's doing is this kind of Christotelic hermeneutic, things like that. I think that is going on. Um, so I use the example of the movie The Usual Suspects. So in the movie The Usual Suspects, you watch the movie and you follow where kind of the camera is taking you. And the camera is taking you to certain conclusions. And then at the end, you realize there's this breadcrumb, separate trail that takes you to a different conclusion. And so you have to rewatch the movie and rethink about how that breadcrumb trail is actually the true plot.
Hmm.
And I think Paul does that in his hermeneutic. I think that's what he's doing. He's saying, if you just read the Old Testament with sort of the obvious, where the obvious lights are showing, then you're going to wonder, has God changed his mind? But if you're following this sort of unknown breadcrumb path, if someone's told you about this path, then Paul's saying, then you'll be able to start picking up the signs that lead you to where I'm going, which is this sort of other thing. That's really important because it is about divine revelation, and it isn't about just sort of putting our heads together and saying what's kind of obvious when we read this text. Paul's following a alternative hermeneutic than many of his Jewish brothers, and I think he has to go a long way of proving that.
Yeah, I think that's
What?
exactly right. I mean, it's always difficult to go through, and you've got to treat almost every sort of citation allusion on its own. But I think Paul is certainly reading them with a sort of an end in mind, with the Christ event
Right.
in mind, and then he sort of, as Richard Hayes would say, he's then kind of like reading backwards.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
Yeah.
in light of that. And I mean, in some cases that you can see explicitly what he's doing, particularly when um, he's talking about the significance of faith, or about the Messiah, or the rock over people have stumbled. But yeah, it's a densely intertextual argument, but it's meant to lead everyone to Christ. So yeah.
As we wrap up, I think the place that often people go after hearing a conversation like this is they want to read more, they want to study more, because it you kind of every time I teach on Romans, I have to go back and read through Romans 9 through 11 to kind of get my thoughts again because it's just so dense. Are there resources on Romans 9 through 11 that you found really, really helpful? Just helps you um, process these texts? Are there things that you hand to students to say, hey, you have questions on Romans 9 through 11, read this?
Yep. Oh, there's a number of things. For more advanced readers, there was a great more Seebeck volume on Romans
Yep.
9 to 11.
Yeah.
I think that was edited by Ross Wagner.
Yeah, that's and it comes from that gospel and election. That language is in it.
Yeah,
Something
the
about gospel and
gospel.
election.
So
Yeah.
that's a little bit more advanced. That's
And
definitely,
expensive.
and expensive. So get it from the library. Um, an older volume, but an interesting one that I think had a big impact on scholarship for a long time, was by, I think it was how do you pronounce his name? Johannes Munk,
Oh
Munck,
yeah, yeah.
called
That's right.
Paul and the Salvation of Mankind.
That's right. Yeah.
Larry
Classic.
Hurtado loved that book. I mean, he was always raving about Johannes Munk. I think that's still a book that's worth visiting. And Munk was one of the few scholars who tackled, in the aftermath of the Second World War, and that's when all the sort of Holocaust stuff has come to light, and it's really, it's like, oh my gosh, I mean, how did this happen? How did Christian theology contribute to that? He's sort of trying to read um, Romans 9 to 11 in light of that, and I think most scholars said that he was at least onto something. Okay, and he at least set the agenda for what happened there afterwards. In terms of commentaries, yeah, I kind of like what Thomas Tobin does with this as well. And for someone who maybe I wouldn't necessarily agree with, but definitely stimulates me to think more on this, the essays by Susan Eastman,
Mm.
I think are very well written. And even if you don't agree, I think she puts the best possible case for that position.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add except, there's some really good. Remind me, I think Mark Reasoner's book, Romans in Full Circle, I think it has a section on Romans 9 through 11, which does kind of a look at.
Yeah,
Do you remember if it does?
I think it does. And I think he covers kind of like Karl Barth and Origin
Yeah.
and people
He
like that. I
does
mean,
kind of a
that's,
reception thing
yeah.
side by side.
And it is a good book, and I've used that as a assigned reading in some of my courses, because it adds a little bit of reception history into it. Yeah, that's good to see how it's been translated over the ages. Sometimes Romans 9 to 11 is just treated as a whole bunch of proof texts, either for Calvinism or
Right.
for dispensationalism. Sometimes it gets treated in light of ecumenical relations between Jews and Christians. Um, Sometimes it gets treated almost as an allegory for the nature of
Hmm.
faith, and what that kind of means. So yeah, there's a pretty good rich perspectives on that you can get into.
I use with my students Kathy Greeb's book, The Story of Romans,
Ah, yes, yep,
which is a short book, so it's not going to get a whole lot of depth, but she does a good job of thinking about the situation in Rome and then talking about Paul's thought in terms of this narrative thought world kind of thing. So students find her stuff really handy. I think Beverly Gaventa has some good, kind of like what you said with Susan Eastman. I don't necessarily agree with Beverly all the time, but she has just a great way of communicating some of the pressure points in her book When in Romans.
Yeah.
So I would take a look at that. Do you remember if preaching Romans? I have it here somewhere. Is there a chapter on Romans 9 through 11 in that?
I don't think so. No. Oh, the other thing that I'm in though. I don't think I did. I certainly didn't cover Romans 9 to 11. Maybe someone else did. The other thing that's good is Peter Oakes reading Romans in Pompeii.
That's right. Yeah,
That
that's a great book.
Yeah, because I think he tries to imagine what it would be like for a Jewish or a Gentile assembly, largely Gentile assembly in Pompeii, reading Romans based on the sort of the demographics and the sociology and the religion at the time, what people there might think of it. So yeah, he's one. That's a kind of like an imaginative reception history, which I think is a terrific. It's creative and it's a terrific read too.
All right, last question here. Is this kind of lightning round, but for the preachers who might be listening, how do you preach Romans 9 through 11 if you don't want to just do like a hour and a half lecture on Paul and his theology of ethnicity and all that? How would you preach kind of? I know you had to do this for your Story God commentary. How
Yeah.
do you get down to how you live the story of these chapters when they are really intricate arguments related to salvation history?
Oh man, that was one of the hardest things. I mean, it's one thing to explain Paul's very dense argument in light of a specific context, and then you got to ask the question, well, so what? How's that going to affect someone doing ministry in inner city Chicago or in suburban Victoria, where I live? What's this got to do with anything? And that was really hard. I think the way I came down on it is, chapter 9, is largely about the importance of faith and God's faithfulness. Okay, that's the big reminder. Okay, God never gives up on his people. There's always an Israel within Israel. Okay, so God never abandons his people. Chapter 10, I believe, is about the importance of mission. If you get to the second half of chapter 10, how can people believe unless they hear? How can they hear unless someone preaches? And how can someone preach unless they're sent? So I think that the topic of mission, and then chapter 11, I would kind of summarize with the story of I believe in your Messiah. Whenever I fly somewhere, if I'm sitting next to a couple of times I've been sitting next to a person who's definitely Jewish, who's wearing like a yarmulke or something, and I get chatting and I say, "You're Jewish," and they go, "Yeah, that's an amazing coincidence." And they say, "Well, are you Jewish?" I say, "No, but I believe in your Messiah."
I'm sure that goes over really well.
Yeah, well, you can. I mean, I go ahead, relax. Don't worry. I'm not going to spend the next 14 hours badgering you into asking you to invite Jesus into your heart. But I am an Anglican priest, so it is kind of one of the things I do. Yeah,
You're just
yeah.
like, read this really big book I wrote.
Yes, yes. So yeah, I mean, and yeah. So I mean, it's kind of like well, I mean, it is an important question. How do Christians relate to Jews? Okay, and
Right.
and how do you relate to your Jewish friends? How do we look at the anti-Semitism of Christian history? Ranging from John Chrysostom's sermons against the Jews, stuff by Martin Luther.
Luther, yeah.
What was done in Nazi Germany, largely by German Protestants, to be perfectly frank.
Right.
What do we make of all that? And that's kind of where you do have to say something. And yeah, that's why I try to talk about those sorts of issues. So yeah, I mean, it is the preaching. It's very hard because it's a foreign world. It's a dense technical argument Paul deploys, but with a bit of reflection and a bit of labor, I think you can find ways to speak into your own context or situation.
Yeah, a couple things I think about. These are broader things than kind of the Jew Gentile question. Is the place of covenantal trust. I mean, a big part of Paul's argument in these chapters is, um, just like in the action movies where the hero says to the sidekick or damsel, like, "Do you trust me?" and they reach out their hand. Like,
Yeah.
there's that sense of, I've done these things in the past to have earned your trust. Now I'm asking you to jump off a building, or I'm asking you to, like, step into the fire do you trust me? And I think Paul is appealing to that kind of argument. God is someone that can be trusted, and in times where you just can't understand what he's doing, he's cashing in on that trust. He's saying, okay, you're going to be stepping into the fire. I need you to trust me. Paul's making a big deal of that, saying the answers aren't going to come, maybe not ever, but you need to step into that. The other thing that I get when I read Romans 9 through 11 is the compassion of God. Um, People have pointed out the alls, all Israel will be saved, and so that he may have mercy on everyone. I've had conversations with my youngest daughter about God's plan for our relatives who are Hindus,
Yeah.
and all of that, and so she's told me recently she's I don't know if you saw The Good Place, but she's praying for a middle place. She said, "I'm praying for a middle place."
Aren't we all? Aren't we all, Nijay?
And she sometimes cries about it, and she's like, thinking about her relatives, and she's really, really sad. And I say to her, I don't have all the answers, but I know that God loves and cares about his creatures more than we do.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I leave it, because it's hard for me to imagine, other scenarios with a God that's so full of compassion, that he wants all to be redeemed, rescued, saved, etc. So when we're having these hard conversations with people, I think it's helpful to start with, when you're talking to your Jewish friends, Exodus, the Lord is compassionate and
Yeah.
merciful, abounding in steadfast love. This is who God is. That's a helpful place for me to return to. That's really spotlighted in these chapters.
And we could end here with the words of Paul from Romans 11:32. God has bound everyone over to disobedience so that he may have mercy on them all.
Yep.
And the final word, if you like, in Romans 9 to 11, besides God's glory, is God's mercy. And that's a thing we can remember.
Yeah, there's something I share with my students a lot, and this can conclude, but it's Tolkien's literary term eucatastrophe.
Yes, the good event, the good.
Yeah, that's right. That when things seem the worst and there's no possible way out, there's this kind of reversal that happens, and the whole point of that is, in Scripture, God is greater and beyond the worst of what we think is happening.
Indeed. Well, Nijay, where can our viewers find you online? I mean,
yeah. So I have a blog, Cruxola. I'm actually inspired partly by you. I'm starting a video podcast kind of thing, Cruxola TV.
Yeah.
So I'll be doing some videos like this. I don't have clever, two birds kinds of things. Not much rhymes with Gupta, other than poopta.
I was gonna say.
But I'm gonna start that. But my blog, I took a break for the summer. I'm back. And then this is a good chance to pitch Northern Seminary. I know you're not on the same season as we are, but we're starting our fall quarter, and we're looking for students to come join us. So we have the Power Team, Scott McKnight, Lynn Kohek. We have Beth Felker-Jones now, David Fitch, Marshall Hatch, Wayne Gordon. So we have a really incredible group of people, and we're, Australia, go to Melbourne, obviously, but we think that Northern has just a great New Testament program. So you can find me at, and this is my favorite part, Northern thought to buy out the website seminary.edu. And so that enough is a reason to come to seminary with us.
Okay. Well, that is terrific. And you can also find you on Twitter, I believe.
Yeah, I'm on social media, not as much as I used to be, but you can snoop around and find me on the various channels.
Okay, well, viewers can find me at mbird12 on Twitter, and also on michaelfbird.substack.com. If you want to find my weekly rantings on various things. Feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If there's something that we've discussed that you found interesting, or you've got a question about, leave it. And hopefully Nijay and I can get back to you and let you know what we're thinking or feeling about that particular object. So thanks everyone for joining us. Always a pleasure to see you, Nijay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to discover Romans 17 through 20 so that we can keep the conversation going.
Or
Some
no,
apocryphal
I,
part of Romans.
I think we'll end up getting it like Romans -5, or
Yeah,
as we
that's
keep
right.
going backwards, Romans -5, which maybe is 1 Corinthians. I don't know. We'll
There
see
you
what
go.
happens.
All right,
Okay.
Mike. Good to see you.
God bless you, Nijay.